Hello everyone, I am Dr. Flux, and welcome back to General Psychology. We're diving into Module 9 this week, where we'll explore one of the most complex and often misunderstood areas of psychology: mental health and psychopathology. Now, I know the word psychopathology sounds pretty intense. It conjures up images of clinical settings, big diagnostic manuals, maybe some misconceptions we picked up from movies or pop culture. But today, we're going to take a step back and ask a fundamental question. What is mental health? And just as importantly, how do we decide when someone's mental health has crossed into what we call a disorder? We'll explore different models that psychologists use to understand mental health, and you'll start to see that, like many things in psychology, there's no single right answer. Again, getting back to that famous George Box quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's exactly how we'll approach mental health in this lecture. Before we jump in, let's quickly revisit some of the topics we covered in Module 8. Which of the following best describes assertive communication? A. Avoiding conflict by staying silent. B. Expressing needs openly and respectfully while considering the feelings of others. C. Using sarcasm or subtle digs to express frustration. Or D. Dominating conversations to ensure your point is heard. The correct answer is B. Assertive communication is about being direct and clear while taking into consideration how other people feel and may receive what you have to say. Let's do another one. Which of the following is an example of intersexual selection? Male frogs call loudly to attract females during mating season. Two male elk compete by clashing antlers during rutting season. A dominant chimpanzee scares off a rival to maintain his status. A female bird defends her nest from a predator. If you said A, you've got it. Intersexual selection is related to behaviors and traits that enhance attracting the opposite sex. Intrasexual selection is related to competition between the same sex. Today, we'll be diving deeply into how we define mental health and why it's important for us to thoughtfully consider this conceptualization. We'll start out by considering the question, what is mental health? We'll then take a look at a few different historical perspectives before diving into modern models of mental health. We'll then critically evaluate some of the current mental health models, looking both at the strengths and limitations of the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, before getting into some summary and review. So let's start with a simple but powerful idea. Mental health is a spectrum. Just like physical health, it's not as simple as saying you're either healthy or unhealthy. You might catch a cold, sprain an ankle, or feel run down without having a serious illness. And the same goes for your mental health. Everyone experiences stress, anxiety, or moments of low mood. That's just part of being human. But that doesn't always mean there's a disorder. The tricky part is figuring out where to draw the line. When does feeling stressed cross over into an anxiety disorder? When does feeling sad after a tough week become clinical depression? These aren't just academic questions. They shape how we view ourselves, how we treat the people around us, and how society responds to mental health challenges. So before we dive into this lecture further, let's reflect. How do you personally define mental health? Is it just the absence of illness? Feeling fine, not stressed, having no problems? Or is it something more, like feeling fulfilled, having a sense of purpose, or being able to bounce back from life's challenges? And here's another layer. How does your culture shape your understanding of mental health? In some cultures, talking about mental health is open and encouraged. In others, it's stigmatized or even seen as a weakness. Your personal experiences, upbringing, and environment all play a role in how you see mental health, and that's something we'll explore more as we go. One of the challenging pieces here is that the way we even discuss health has shifted over time and can change depending on our culture. Some of this variability comes down to the way we think about the body and the mind philosophically, adding another layer of complication. For example, have you ever wondered why we separate out mental health from physical health? Is it like this across cultures? Does mental health condition need to have a defined biological or genetic component to be valid? How do our definitions of mental health conditions feed back into the way that those conditions present? To really understand how we think about mental health today, we need to look at how people have understood it throughout history. From ideas about demonic possession to theories about imbalanced bodily fluids, the history of mental health is as fascinating as it is complex. So let's take a journey back and see how far we've come and how some old ideas still influence what we think today. The history of mental illness is winding. It's filled with some wild theories that may seem quite extreme to us now, and a few conceptualizations that probably did more harm than good. But some insights that we moved away from are coming back now in modern times. To understand where we are today, it helps to explore the journey we've taken. So let's take a trip through time and explore how societies have made sense of mental health across the ages. Before we had a deeper understanding of how the body works, mental health was often conceptualized through the lens of supernatural forces. If someone heard voices or acted strangely, people thought that they were possessed by demons or cursed by the gods. But here's an interesting twist. In some cultures, these behaviors weren't always seen as negative. People who experienced visions or heard voices might have been viewed as having a special connection to the spiritual world, like shamans or prophets. Interestingly, there is some data to suggest that individuals experiencing psychosis in cultures with these belief systems today have better long-term outcomes than people with similar conditions in cultures with more biological approaches, though the reasons for this are still poorly understood. However, many of the treatment options that are aligned with the supernatural model of mental health end up being unhelpful at best and downright horrifying at worst. We're talking about things like exorcisms, food and sleep deprivation, and even trepanation, drilling holes into the skull to release evil spirits. And sadly, in some cases, people with mental health issues were extremely ostracized, feared, or severely harmed. As societies developed, they formed more structured approaches to understanding health. While I will primarily be focusing on Western traditions because they're the ones that I'm most familiar with, I do want to mention that many other cultural systems of health understanding exist, and some of them have roots going far back in time. Ayurvedic medicine in India has a 5,000-year history, and traditional Chinese medicine goes back at least 2,000 years. Additionally, many indigenous Americans have complex holistic approaches to wellness dating back to long before Europeans settled there. However, the foundation of our Western approach to understanding mental health begins in ancient Greece with Hippocrates, often referred to as the father of modern medicine. Hippocrates proposed that mental illness was caused by imbalances within the body. He introduced the theory of the four humors: blood, which was associated with a cheerful and outgoing personality; phlegm was linked to calmness; yellow bile was thought to cause anger; and black bile was believed to cause sadness and relate to depression. So if someone was feeling really down, Hippocrates might say they had too much black bile, what was previously called melancholia, and what we would call today depression. Hippocrates was onto something, and a lot of our modern understandings of mental health have leaned into biological conceptualizations. But some of his details were less than helpful. Treatment for unhelpful moods under this humoral theory involved rebalancing the humors. Some treatments focused on diet and exercise, which we still view as helpful today, but others involved things like bloodletting, which was often less helpful. This approach influenced hundreds of years of Western medicine and provided effective treatments before we were able to gain deeper biological insights. However, it was often less than helpful for people who suffered from extreme mental health disruptions. Additionally, until our understanding of biology expanded further, many unhelpful supernatural conceptualizations of mental health endured. Without effective treatments, many people with extreme behavioral symptoms were placed in asylums where they were subjected to inhumane and cruel treatment. By the 18th and 19th centuries, there was growing recognition that maybe locking people away in asylums wasn't the best approach. This led to the rise of the moral treatment movement, which emphasized kindness and respect for people with mental health challenges. Reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and Dorothea Dix in the United States advocated for more humane treatment. The idea was that people could recover, or at least improve, with supported environments, structured routines, and compassionate care. Investments were made in improving facilities that housed the mentally unwell. It was a huge step forward from the days of bloodletting and chaining people to walls. But even with the best intentions, these institutions became overcrowded and the quality of care often declined. It was clear that while compassion was essential, it wasn't enough on its own to provide people with dignity. By the turn of the 20th century, we see two major shifts in how mental health was understood. First, there was Sigmund Freud and the rise of psychoanalysis. Freud introduced the idea that mental illness could stem from unconscious conflicts and early childhood experiences. He believed that by exploring these hidden parts of the mind through techniques like free association and dream analysis, people could achieve insight and healing. But while Freud was digging into the unconscious, the medical model was making a comeback and expanding. Charles Mercier, a British psychiatrist, is one of the first to propose that mental health conditions could be brain disorders. By the mid-20th century, advances in psychopharmacology led to the development of medications like antipsychotics and antidepressants. This reinforced the idea that mental illness was rooted in biology and could be treated by medications that influence brain functioning. Around this time, the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, was published in 1952. It provided a standardized way to diagnose mental illness, which was a big step forward. But as we'll see in a bit, it's not without its controversies. Let's do a quick attention check. Which of the following aligns with a supernatural conceptualization of mental health? Imbalanced brain chemicals, unconscious childhood conflicts, demonic possession, or a lack of physical exercise? If you pick C, you're right on target. Demonic possession is congruent with a supernatural perspective and will be treated with interventions like exorcisms. So we've taken a look at how people have historically understood mental illness, from supernatural explanations to early medical theories like the four humors. But where are we now? In today's world, psychologists use several modern models to explain mental health. Each model looks at mental health through a different lens, whether it's focusing on biology, psychological processes, or even the social environment we live in. And while no single model has the answers, together they help us understand the complexity of mental health. So let's break down the big three: the biological, psychological, and sociocultural models. Then we'll look to see how they come together in what's called the biopsychosocial model. First up is the biological model. This model views mental health through the lens of brain chemistry, genetics, and neurobiology. According to the biological model, mental disorders are caused by things like neurotransmitter levels in the brain, genetic predispositions, or abnormalities in brain structure. For example, schizophrenia has been linked to dopamine dysregulation. Depression is often associated with altered serotonin signaling. And bipolar disorder has both genetic components and some observable changes in brain structure. The biological model has paved the way for treatments like antidepressants, antipsychotic medications, and mood stabilizers. It's also benefited from advances in brain imaging technology like fMRI scans, which help us see how different parts of the brain function in people with mental health conditions. But while the biological model has given us important insights, it doesn't explain everything. Mental health isn't just about the chemicals in your brain. It's also shaped by other body systems, the structure of your thoughts, as well as life experiences and your environment. And that's where the next models come in. Next, we have the psychological model, which shifts the focus from brain chemistry to what's happening in our minds. Think of it as transitioning from looking at brain hardware to examining brain software. This model emphasizes the role of thought patterns, emotions, behavior, and early life experience in shaping mental health. It suggests that mental disorders can develop from maladaptive thought patterns like negative self-talk, through trauma, or even learned behaviors. For example, depression, through this lens, might stem from cognitive distortions, like thinking I'm a failure or nothing good ever happens to me. Anxiety disorders can develop through conditioning. If you had a panic attack in a crowded place, you might start associating crowds with fear. PTSD arises from traumatic experiences that disrupt how we process emotions and memories. Treatments based on this model include cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which helps people reframe negative thought patterns. There's also psychodynamic therapy, which digs into unconscious conflicts from early life, and humanistic approaches that focus on personal growth and self-actualization. The psychological model shows us that mental health isn't just about brain chemicals and structures. It's also about how you think, feel, and interpret the world around you. Moving on, the sociocultural model zooms out even further and looks at how society, culture, and environment impact mental health. According to this model, mental disorders aren't just about what's happening in your brain or mind, they're also shaped by the world around you. Factors like poverty, discrimination, family dynamics, and cultural expectations play a huge role in mental health. For example, communities facing systemic oppression or economic hardship often experience higher rates of depression and anxiety. Some mental health conditions are culture-bound syndromes, disorders that only appear in certain cultural contexts. In some cultures, there's significant stigma around mental health, which can discourage people from seeking help. Treatments influenced by this model focus on community-based interventions, public health policies, and culturally sensitive therapy that acknowledges a person's unique background and experience. The sociocultural model reminds us that mental health isn't just an individual issue, it's deeply connected to the world that we live in. So we've reviewed the biological, psychological, and sociocultural models, but what happens if we combine them? Enter the biopsychosocial model. This model takes the best of all three perspectives to provide a holistic understanding of mental health. It recognizes that mental disorders aren't caused by just one thing. They result from a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. For example, depression might be influenced by genetic predispositions on the biological level, negative thought patterns on the psychological level, and social isolation on the sociocultural level. Similarly, schizophrenia could involve dopamine dysregulation on the biological level, the impact of stressful life events on the psychological level, and a lack of community support on the sociocultural level. The beauty of the biopsychosocial model is that it allows for personalized treatment that addresses multiple dimensions of a person's life. It's not about finding one cause or one solution. It's about understanding the complexity of mental health and treating people as whole individuals. So now that we've explored different models of mental health and how they help us understand the complexity of the mind, how do we take all these perspectives and apply them in a clinical setting? How do psychologists and psychiatrists decide when someone's experiencing a mental disorder? That's where the DSM comes in, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's often called the Bible of Mental Health Diagnoses, and we'll be diving into these diagnostic classifications more deeply in our next lecture. But before we dive into the categories of mental health, let's take a closer look at the DSM. What is it? Why is it useful? And why it's also been the subject of some pretty heated debates in the field of psychology. So what exactly is the DSM? First published in 1952 by the American Psychiatric Association, its goal was to provide a standardized system for diagnosing mental health conditions, ensuring that clinicians across the country and eventually the world had a common language for discussing mental disorders. We're currently on the 5th edition, known as the DSM-5, which was released in 2013. The DSM provides detailed criteria for diagnosing everything from anxiety disorders to schizophrenia to personality disorders. And there's no doubt that the DSM has been useful. But the DSM isn't perfect. It is a model after all. And as we've been discussing, all models are wrong, but some are useful. The DSM has some clear strengths. It provides standardized criteria for diagnosing mental disorders. Before the DSM, there was a lot of ambiguity around this. What one clinician called depression, another one might call melancholia. The DSM helps reduce that confusion. It's a crucial tool for research. By creating consistent diagnostic categories, researchers can study mental health conditions more effectively and compare findings across different studies. It also helps guide treatment decisions. Clinicians can develop more targeted treatment plans based on specific diagnoses. And finally, it plays a big role in public policy and insurance. Many insurance companies use DSM diagnoses to determine what treatments they'll cover, and it influences how mental health is addressed in our broader healthcare systems. But even with these strengths, the DSM isn't without its flaws. And that's where things get a bit interesting. One of the biggest critiques of the DSM is that it tends to medicalize normal human experiences, essentially turning everyday emotions and behaviors into disorders. For example, generalized anxiety disorder is a legitimate diagnosis, but its critics argue that the criteria have become broad enough to include what might just be common everyday worries. Who hasn't felt anxious about work, relationships, or the future before? Similarly, where do we draw the line between grieving the loss of a loved one and being diagnosed with clinical depression? Some critics argue that by expanding diagnostic criteria, the DSM risks pathologizing normal life experiences. And then there's another layer here, the pharmaceutical industry. Some propose that the growth of the DSM has been influenced by drug companies eager to develop medications for newly defined disorders. This raises questions about whether we're diagnosing people to help them or to sell them more treatments. Another major critique of the DSM is its cultural bias. The DSM is primarily based on Western cultural norms, which means it doesn't always account for how mental health is expressed in different cultures. Certain culture-bound syndromes, like Coro in Southeast Asia or Ataque de Nervios in Latin America, don't fit neatly into the DSM's diagnostic criteria. This can lead to misdiagnosis or even stigmatization. Additionally, in some cultures, expressing emotions openly might be discouraged, while in others it's the norm. If clinicians aren't sensitive to these cultural differences, they might interpret certain behaviors as symptoms of a disorder when they're actually just typical cultural expressions. So while the DSM aims to be a universal tool, it's important to recognize its limitations and the cultural context that shapes how we understand mental health. Let's pause for a moment of reflection. Do you think labeling mental health conditions as disorders helps people by providing clarity and access to treatment? Or does it risk stigmatizing normal human experiences? Why or why not? This is a complex question with no easy answers, and your perspective might evolve as you learn more about mental health. But reflecting on these ideas is the first step toward understanding the power and limitations of the models we use. We've covered a lot of ground today, from historical perspectives to our current DSM. Let's review the highlights. We discussed how Western concepts of mental health have shifted over time, from supernatural models to biological ones. We hit on Hippocrates' humoral theory, moral therapy, Freud, and the birth of viewing mental health as a brain disorder. We discussed modern theoretical orientations, including biological, psychological, and sociological models, as well as the unified framework that many clinicians use today, the biopsychosocial model. We finished up by discussing the development of the DSM, noting both its strengths and limitations when it comes to categorizing mental health conditions. As we wrap up, I want to bring us back to that George Box quote, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." The DSM is a useful tool for diagnosing and treating mental health conditions, but it's just one lens. Mental health is complex, personal, and influenced by a mix of biology, psychology, and sociocultural factors. I want you to think about your own personal model of mental health. Reflecting on this is not just about learning a diagnostic framework, you're learning about who you are. You're figuring out what helps you thrive, how to support others, and how to navigate the inevitable ups and downs of life. Mental health isn't just about avoiding illness. It's about growth, resilience, and living a life that feels meaningful to you. Before we close, let's do a bit of review. Which model focuses on the interplay between biological, psychological, and sociological factors? A. Humorism, B. The moral treatment movement, C. Psychoanalysis, or D. The biopsychosocial model? If you chose D, the biopsychosocial model, you're spot on. Many modern clinicians use this model to understand and map out the complexities that contribute to mental health functioning. Which of the following is a common critique of the DSM? It focuses too much on cultural differences. It sometimes medicalizes normal human experiences. It ignores biological factors in mental health. It hasn't changed since its first edition. The answer here is B. The DSM, while incredibly useful in standardization and research, has been criticized as overly pathologizing naturally occurring behaviors. Mental health is complex, dynamic, and deeply personal. As we move forward into this module, we'll explore specific mental health disorders, how they're diagnosed, and how they're treated. But never forget, the models we use are just tools to help us navigate the messy, beautiful, complicated reality of being human. And with that, remember, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. I'll see you in the next lecture.